On my 68th birthday, my daughter handed me a plastic grocery bag. Inside were my medications, 2 pairs of socks, and the little porcelain bird I used to keep on my kitchen windowsill. That was all. No cake, no card, no gathering of my grandchildren. Just that bag, and the quiet instruction to pack the rest of my things as quickly as I could because it's time. I'm Evelyn Hart, 68, and that was the moment I knew they were done with me. Subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. It had been building up for a while, of course, but I suppose I didn't want to see it. That evening, they took me to a nursing home on the outskirts of town, a low beige building that smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled cabbage. The kind of place you pass on the highway without a second glance. The kind of place, I realized as I stood there in my sensible shoes, where people go to be forgotten. The ride there was silent. My daughter gripped the steering wheel like it might slip from her hands, and my son stared out the window, pretending to be absorbed in the passing trees. I watched their reflections in the glass. Both of them looked so tired, or maybe just eager to be done with me. I wanted to ask them if they remembered when I used to braid my daughter's hair before school, or how I stayed up all night sewing my son's Halloween costumes because he'd changed his mind at the last minute. But I stayed quiet. The driveway curved around like a question mark, and when the car stopped, neither of them looked at me. My daughter popped the trunk. My son retrieved my small suitcase, the same one I'd taken on a church trip to Nashville 20 years earlier. I stepped out, my legs stiff from the drive. The air smelled of cut grass and something else, something stale. There was no hug goodbye. Just rushed. "Take care, Mom," before they slid back into the car. I stood there, suitcase in hand, the plastic bag tucked under my arm, and watched their taillights disappear down the drive. They didn't look back. A nurse met me at the door, young, kind enough. She called me Mrs. Hart, which sounded too formal, like I was someone else. I followed her inside, past beige walls decorated with faded prints of flowers and birds, past other women who looked like me, sitting quietly in armchairs with their hands folded or their eyes closed. That night, I sat on the edge of my new bed, listening to the ticking of a clock on the wall. I unpacked the suitcase, a few shirts, a pair of trousers, and my toothbrush. The little porcelain bird went on the windowsill, though the view here was nothing like home, just the parking lot, and beyond it, a stand of scraggly pines. I thought about how birthdays used to be. Balloons, laughter, my husband grilling burgers in the backyard while the kids ran through the sprinkler. The smell of lilacs from the bush by the porch. I thought about how, just last year, I'd made my daughter's favorite lemon cake from scratch for her birthday. And now here I am. I didn't cry, not that night. I just sat there listening to the quiet dot. It's funny how you can be surrounded by nurses, other residents, staff, and still feel so utterly alone. The next morning, I found myself watching the cars that came and went from the lot, hoping absurdly that mine would pull up, that maybe they'd come back and say it was all a mistake, that they'd take me home. But no car came for me. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting, no slammed doors, just the soft closing of a chapter I hadn't realized was ending. Over the next few days, I settled into the rhythm of the place. Meals at set times, bingo on Tuesdays, a weekly visit from a volunteer with a therapy dog. I smiled politely. I made small talk, but inside, I felt hollowed out. I kept thinking back to that birthday, the way my daughter had avoided my eyes, the way my son had stayed silent. I wondered if they'd planned it, if there had been meetings, discussions about what to do with me. The phrase echoed in my mind. It's time. I suppose it was time. Time for them to move on. Time for me to let go of whatever I'd been holding on to. But that didn't make it hurt any less. The days blurred together, as days do in places like this. Mornings smelled of weak coffee and oatmeal. Afternoons were punctuated by the distant sound of television game shows. Evenings fell quietly, the halls dimly lit, as if the building itself was growing tired. Sometimes I would sit by the window, the porcelain bird in my hand, and think about the life I used to have, the garden I tended, the pies I baked, Christmas mornings, the scraped knees I bandaged. All of it felt like another lifetime, like someone else's story. And yet, here I was, Evelyn Hart, 68, in a small room with a view of a parking lot, trying to understand how I'd gone from being the center of their world to an afterthought. But I didn't feel angry, not really, just invisible. And in that invisibility, I started to see things more clearly. The days at the home fell into a rhythm. So steady, it felt almost like the ticking of that clock on my wall. Morning light would seep through the slats of the blinds, casting long stripes across the bedspread, and I would wake before the aides came to check in. I always did. I had been rising early for most of my life. After all, some habits don't break just because the world has changed around you. I would sit there, watching the light shift, and I would think, my mind had nowhere else to go now, and more, it would drift backward. It's funny, isn't it? How when you have nothing left to do for others, all that's left is to remember what you did. I remember the nights with no sleep, when my daughter, Hannah, was a baby. She was colicky and cried so hard her little face would turn red, her fists balled up tight as if she were fighting something invisible. I would walk the floor with her, hour after hour, singing whatever lullabies came to mind, until my voice grew hoarse and the sun began to rise. I would press her to my chest so she could hear my heart. That seemed to help. My husband, God rest his soul, would sleep through it all, not out of indifference, but out of exhaustion from working double shifts at the plant. Then there was Thomas, my boy. Always so curious. He would take things apart, clocks, radios, toys, just to see how they worked. I remember the time he took apart the toaster and couldn't put it back together. We went without toast for a week until I could save enough to buy a new one. I never scolded him. I just watched the way his little brow furrowed with concentration, and I thought to myself, one day, this boy will build great things. And so I worked. I worked harder than I thought I could, just to give them the space to dream. When my husband was laid off, it was me who took in ironing for the neighbors, me who cleaned houses on weekends, who mended clothes at night by the dim light of the kitchen bulb. My fingers would ache, the skin cracked from soap and bleach, but I kept going. I kept going because they needed me to. There were birthdays, of course. Every one of them was marked with cakes baked from scratch, balloons bought from the dollar store, handmade cards because we couldn't always afford the ones at the shop. Hannah's favorite was lemon, the kind with the tart icing that made her giggle with delight. Thomas loved chocolate, deep and rich, the kind that left smudges on his cheeks. I remember staying up until the small hours decorating their cakes, wanting so badly for those little details, the piped frosting flowers, the careful lettering to make them feel special. Christmas. I would sew them pajamas when money was tight, staying up late after they'd gone to bed, the hum of my old Singer machine filling the house. I remember wrapping the gifts so carefully, making them look more plentiful than they really were, just so they'd wake up to a sense of wonder. And I remember the looks on their faces of pure joy, untainted by any awareness of how hard-won those mornings were. School nights, I would help them with their homework, even when I was backyard. Thomas struggling with his sums, Hannah practicing her spelling. I would sit at the kitchen table with them, sipping cold tea, my eyelids heavy. But I wouldn't leave them to figure it out alone. No, I wanted them to feel supported. I wanted them to know that they were never alone in their struggles. When they were sick, I was the one who stayed up, cool clothes on foreheads, measuring out doses of medicine, counting the hours until fever broke. I remember once, when Hannah had the flu so bad she could hardly lift her head. I stayed by her side 3 days straight, spooning broth into her mouth, wiping her face, holding her hand through the worst of it. I didn't sleep. I couldn't, not while she needed me. And birthdays for my husband, too. Anniversaries. I always made sure to mark the days. I kept the family calendar, remembered the appointments, paid the bills, balanced the checkbook on scraps of paper when there wasn't enough for a proper ledger. I stretched every dollar until it nearly tore, but I made sure the lights stayed on, the rent was paid, and the kids had shoes on their feet. I suppose I kept my hurts quiet. That was the way I was raised. When my husband would come home late, smelling of beer and weariness, I'd take his coat, heat up his plate, and not ask questions. When he forgot our anniversary one year, the only year he did, in fairness, I just went out to the garden and pulled weeds until the sting of it passed. No sense adding to his burdens. And when he passed so suddenly, a heart attack one autumn morning when the leaves were turning, I grieved quietly. I had to. There were funeral arrangements, bills to pay, a house to keep running. I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I remember standing in the kitchen after the service, the smell of coffee and casseroles filling the house, and thinking, I have to hold steady for them now. I have to be both mother and father. And I worked, a second job, evenings at the grocery store, to cover what we lost with his passing. I missed school plays, parent meetings, but I always left notes in their lunchboxes, packed with care in the early morning light. I tried to be present where it mattered most, even when time and exhaustion conspired against me. There were so many small things, to the forgotten mittens I brought to school in the dead of winter. My favorite soup was made just right when one of them was down. The rides to and from friends' houses, the sleepovers I hosted despite my bone-deep fatigue, the sacrifices I made silently, the new dress I didn't buy, the vacation I never took, so they could have what they needed, and sometimes even what they wanted. I didn't do it because I expected repayment. That thought never crossed my mind. Love isn't a ledger. But now, sitting in this small room, I couldn't help but wonder if they remembered any of it. Did it count for nothing in the end? The thing about giving and giving is that, after a while, you don't even notice when the well runs dry. You just keep reaching, keep offering, until the day comes when your hands are empty and no one's reaching back. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that they let me go, but that they did so as if all those years had never been. I think of it often, these quiet hours in the home. The weight of memory sits with me, heavier than the suitcase I brought here. And when I see the aides bustling about, or the visitors who come for others, I wonder if they can see on my face the map of all I gave, all I carried, and how light my hands are now. But I say nothing. I smile when I'm expected to. I thank the nurses for their kindness, and I sit by the window, the porcelain bird watching with me, and I remember, because memory is all I have left. And for now, it is enough to keep me company. The days stretched on, quiet and uneventful, each one blending into the next like watercolors left out in the rain. I would rise, go through the motions of mourning, sit by the window, and watch the world beyond this place. A world that no longer seemed to have room for me. The porcelain bird kept its silent vigil, perched on the sill, as if it, too, was waiting for something that would never come. It was in those still hours that I began to see it all for what it had been. The 100 quiet hurts, the small, almost invisible ways I had been erased, bit by bit, long before the day they left me here. It hadn't happened all at once, of course. It never does. It was a slow unthreading, like a sweater pulled loose, stitch by stitch, until all that remained was a tangled heap, where something whole had once been. But it began with the forgotten calls. At first, they would come regularly. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, Hannah would call, her voice bright and hurried, telling me of the children's school projects, of work deadlines, of weekend plans. Thomas would check in, too, sometimes from an airport lounge or his office, distracted but present enough to ask how I was managing. I cherished those calls. I planned my Sundays around them, the phone close by, the kettle kept warm so I could sip my tea as I listened. But over time, the calls came later, or not at all. The excuses began, so busy, so much going on, meant to call but the day got away from them. I understood. I always did. I would say, "It's fine, dear, I know you're busy," and I did know. But that didn't stop the hollow from forming each time I set the phone down. The quiet settling around me, thicker than before. Then there were the visits. They grew fewer, too. In the early years after their father passed, they came often, bringing the children, filling the house with noise and life, the sound of laughter, the clatter of dishes, the familiar chaos that only family can bring. I lived for those weekends. I would clean the house from top to bottom, bake their favorite things, and put fresh sheets on the beds. I wanted everything to be just right. But the visits dwindled. First from monthly to every few months. Then maybe twice a year. I would hear their reasons, the children's activities, work obligations, the distance to great, and I would nod, even though they couldn't see me. I would tell them, "Of course, I understand. Holidays were the hardest. The first Christmas I spent alone came like a blow I hadn't braced for." They said they were sorry, that travel was impossible that year, that perhaps we could do a video call. I sat in my chair by the window, the little tree I'd put up twinkling softly, and watched the snow fall as I waited for the call that came late, brief, and full of apologies. I said, "It's fine, dear. I understand." I always said that it wasn't just absence that left its mark. It was a presence, too, but of a different sort. Subtle shifts, a note in their voices that I hadn't heard before. A kind of impatience, a way of speaking to me as if I were fragile glass, as if I might break under the weight of their words. They would correct me gently when I forgot a detail, when I mixed up a date or a name. At first, I laughed it off. We all forget things sometimes. But their glances, the sighs they tried to hide, they chipped away at me. I began to question myself, to double-check every sentence before I spoke. And then came the advice, always well-meaning, always wrapped in care, but heavy all the same. Maybe you should think about downsizing, Mom. The house is too much for you. Maybe you should stop driving, Mom. It's not safe anymore. Have you thought about getting help with the yard, the bills, the groceries? I know they meant well. I know they were trying to look out for me. But with every suggestion, I felt a little smaller, a little less capable, a little more like a burden. The garden was the first to go. I had tended it for decades. Roses, peonies, marigolds, a small patch of herbs by the kitchen door. It had been my pride, my refuge. But after Thomas mentioned that the yard was looking untidy, that perhaps it was time to let someone else take it over, I found I couldn't bring myself to go out there anymore. The weeds grew, the blooms faded, and one day I looked out and saw that my garden was gone, replaced by overgrowth and neglect. And I felt as if a part of me had withered. Then came the sorting, the quiet pushing. When they visited, they would suggest we go through things. Maybe clear out the attic, the basement, the closets. They called it helping. They said it would ease my mind. But each item they set aside felt like an erasure. The toys my children once played with, the letters my husband had written me in the early days, the dishes I'd saved for special occasions, all deemed unnecessary, all gently urged toward donation or the bin. I would agree, not wanting to seem difficult. But inside, I mourned each loss. Even the way they spoke of me changed. I would hear it in conversations with others, when they thought I wasn't listening. She's getting older now. She forgets things sometimes. She's set in her ways. As if I were no longer fully present. As if I were already halfway gone. And I would stand there, invisible in plain sight, feeling the sharpness of their words like a cold wind through a cracked window. There was never malice. I must be clear about that. They didn't mean to hurt me. They thought they were helping, protecting, doing what was best. And perhaps, in some ways, they were. But intention doesn't dull the ache. Kindness doesn't always feel kind. And love can wound, even when it doesn't mean to. I kept their pictures on my dresser. I would look at them each night before bed. The smiling faces of my children, my grandchildren, frozen in time. I would trace their outlines with my eyes, trying to remember the feel of their hugs, the sound of their laughter. But even memory grows dim when it is not fed. And so, the hurts gathered, like small stones in my pockets, weighing me down. Not one great betrayal, but 100 small ones, 100 quiet dismissals, 100 ways of being gently, lovingly, set aside. I think that's what I would want people to understand, that it isn't always the grand gestures that break a heart. Sometimes, it's the slow fading, the quiet forgetting, the soft, gradual letting go. And by the time you notice, it's already done. I would sit in my chair by the window, the porcelain bird beside me, and wonder how it came to this, how I went from being their center to an afterthought, from being needed to being managed. And I would wonder, too, what final straw would come, what line they would cross that would make even my understanding heart go still. But I didn't have the answer, not yet. All I had were the stones in my pockets, the weight of memory, and the long, silent days that stretched ahead. The winter that followed my first Christmas alone was long, colder than most. Or perhaps it simply felt that way. The wind rattled the windows of the house, and the days seemed to fold into one another, short and gray. I stayed inside, wrapped in my cardigan, watching the world through frost-touched glass. The phone rang less and less. Even the polite check-ins had begun to fade, replaced by quick messages or forwarded emails about flu shots or senior discounts, as if I had become just another task to manage from afar. I told myself not to mind. I tried to keep busy. I read books I couldn't seem to finish. I made small meals that went half-eaten. I kept the house tidy, though the silence echoed louder in clean rooms. And I waited for what, I wasn't sure. A visit, perhaps. A reminder that I was still part of their world. It came one Sunday in February. The knock at the door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Hannah stood there, bundled in her coat, a clipboard clutched to her chest. Beside her, Thomas shifted from foot to foot, as if the ground beneath him were too hot to bear. I felt a flicker of hope, a foolish, eager joy that they had come to see me, to bring warmth to that cold winter day. But that joy faded quickly, as their eyes met mine not with softness, but with resolve. They stepped inside, shaking off the snow. We stood in the hallway, and I noticed how they didn't remove their coats, how they kept their gloves on. It was not a visit for tea, not a visit for stories. It was something else. Pana spoke first, her voice gentle, practiced. She explained that they'd been thinking, worrying, and discussing. That they had found a good place, she assured me, where I would be safe, where I wouldn't have to worry about shoveling snow or climbing stairs. Thomas nodded, silent, his jaw tight. They had made arrangements. Everything was ready. All I needed to do was agree. I listened. I listened because that is what I have always done. I let them lay out their case, their reasons, their reassurances. The home was lovely, they said. Just outside the city. A small room, but cozy. Activities, meals provided, nurses on hand. No more worries about the house, the bills, the maintenance. No more isolation, they said, as if this isolation wasn't of their own making. I looked at them, these children I had raised, these children who now spoke to me as if I were a fragile thing, incapable of deciding the course of my own life. And I felt something inside me shift. A quiet break, a final thread snapped. I asked them when they had planned this. They hesitated. A few months later, they admitted. Papers had been signed, deposits made. The house, it was already listed. My house, the house where I had lived for over 40 years, where I had brought them home from the hospital, where we had celebrated birthdays and Christmases and graduations, sold, without my knowing, without my consent. Thomas tried to explain. It was for the best, he said. The market was good. They had handled everything. I wouldn't have to worry. And Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she did not take my hand. She said it was love that guided them, that they couldn't bear to see me alone, struggling, but it wasn't love. I saw it then, clear as day. It was convenient. It was guilt, dressed up as care. It was easier, this way, for them. Easier than the slow decay of weekly calls, than the burden of visits, than the discomfort of seeing me age. I felt the room tilt, as if the ground beneath me had given way. I steadied myself on the banister, though I did not let them see my hands tremble. I asked them when they thought to tell me. When had I stopped being part of the decisions of my own life? They had no answer, only apologies, only excuses wrapped in soft voices. They stayed an hour, perhaps less. They left behind the paperwork, the brochures for the home, the name of the realtor who would handle the sale. They said they would return in a few days to help me pack. They kissed my cheek, quick and cold, and left. I sat down in the chair by the window, the porcelain bird in my palm, tracing its smooth edges as if it could anchor me. Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing the garden I could no longer tend, the house that was no longer mine. I thought of the life built inside those walls, the nights spent rocking sick children. The meals were cooked, the arguments, the laughter, the quiet mornings when all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and the chirp of birds at the feeder. And now, it is gone, erased, as if it had never been mine. All decided without me, all signed away while I folded laundry, while I tended my small, solitary life, unaware that the rug was being pulled from under me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once braided Hannah's hair for school, where I had helped Thomas with his homework, where I had shared coffee with my husband in the early dawn. I sat there and I thought of every small dismissal, every quiet hurt that had led to this moment. I thought of how easily they had crossed this final line, how sure they were that I would accept it, because I always had before. But something had changed. That thread that snapped it left behind a clarity I hadn't felt in years. They had taken my voice from me, slowly, gently, but completely. And now they would see what my silence would mean. Morning came, pale and cold. I rose from the table, brewed a pot of tea, and watched the steam curl into the air. I felt no anger, not then, only a great, deep stillness, the kind of stillness that comes when you finally see the truth laid bare. I knew what I had to do. I knew that whatever came next, it would come from me. No one else would decide my path again. The papers they left sat untouched on the counter. The brochures, the contact numbers, the realtor's card. I looked at them once, then turned away. I opened the window, just a crack, and let the winter air in. It was sharp, bracing, real. And I breathed it in, feeling for the first time in a long time that I was awake, truly awake. The final line had been crossed, but they would not find me where they expected, not anymore. After that visit, after the papers left on my counter, after their carefully rehearsed words and their quick, guilty exits, I did not argue, I did not plead, I did not even call to ask why. I went silent, and in that silence, I began to gather myself in ways I think I had forgotten I could. The days that followed were strangely clear, as if the world had sharpened. The cold air outside bit at the windows, but inside, I felt steady. I moved through the house with a quiet purpose, touching the walls, the furniture, the small things that had made this place mine. My fingers traced the grooves of the banister, polished smooth by years of hands sliding along it. I stood in the doorway of each room, remembering the life that had unfolded there. I didn't cry. The tears had dried up long ago. I think all that remained now was a quiet determination. The phone rang, of course. They called to check in, to ask if I had thought things over, to remind me of dates and deadlines, but I let it ring. I let it go to the machine, where their voices filled the empty space with more of the same soft pressure wrapped in concern. I listened, but I did not answer. They sent emails, 2 links to virtual tours of the home they'd chosen, messages urging me to see reason, to respond. I read them once, then closed the laptop. Silence was my reply. In that silence, I began to plan. It wasn't dramatic, like the stories you hear of people storming out or making grand speeches. No, mine was a quiet, deliberate retreat. I started with my papers, the ones that mattered, the deed to the house, the insurance documents, my will. I gathered them from the drawer in the study where they had sat, undisturbed, for years. I spread them out on the dining table, the morning light catching on their creased edges. I read each one slowly, carefully, as if seeing them for the first time. Then I made calls, not to my children, but to the people who could help me see the truth of things. A lawyer whose card I had kept since my husband passed, a kind woman at the bank who had always been patient with my questions. I spoke little, but I listened. And what I learned, in those quiet conversations, was sobering. They had no right. The house was mine. Still, the signatures on certain forms, they weren't mine, though they bore my name. The account that had been drawn upon one, I hadn't touched in years. There are betrayals that come with shouts and slamming doors. And then there are betrayals that come with forged ink and quiet decisions made in rooms where you are not invited. This was the latter, and it cut deeper, perhaps, because it wore the mask of care. But I did not let the hurt drown me. I let it steady me. I let it remind me that I was not as powerless as they believed. I began to save, small amounts at first, what I could spare from the pension, from the little I had put in over the years. I was careful, discreet. I opened an account they did not know about. I made lists of what I would need, what it would take to leave if I chose to. I spoke with the lawyer again, setting things in motion slowly, methodically. No one knew. No one suspected. I let them think I was adrift, waiting for their guidance, their decisions. In the evenings, I would sit by the window with the porcelain bird in my hand. I would watch the light fade from the sky, the garden now a tangle of bare branches and brittle grass, and I would think of what it meant to disappear not in body, but in spirit, to be erased by degrees, until you no longer recognized your own reflection. That was what had been happening to me, but no more. The silence grew, and in it, I found strength. When Hannah and Thomas visited again, weeks later, they found me unchanged, at least on the surface. I welcomed them in, I served tea, I listened, as they spoke of timelines and arrangements. I nodded where they expected me to nod, but I offered no promises. I gave no ground, and when they left, convinced perhaps that I had accepted their plan, I returned to my preparations. There was no need for confrontation. No need for harsh words. My silence was my shield, my quiet refusal my sword. I learned, in those weeks, the power of withholding, of choosing when and how to speak, and when to simply let others reveal themselves. And reveal themselves they did. The messages grew more insistent. The visits were more strained. I saw in their eyes the frustration, the worry that their careful structure was beginning to crack. But I did not rush. I moved like the winter slow, inevitable. I watched, I waited, I kept my own counsel, and I planned. There were moments when the loneliness of it all pressed down on me, when I missed the sound of my children's laughter, the warmth of family gathered at my table. But I reminded myself that those things had been gone long before this. What I missed was memory, not present reality. And memory, I learned, could sustain me if I let it. I began to take small walks when the weather allowed, just to the corner and back, at first, then farther, to the park where I used to take the children when they were small. The benches were worn, the playground faded, but the air was sharp and clean, and it filled my lungs with something that felt like purpose. I would sit there, bundled in my coat, and watch the world go by, and I would feel, for those moments, like myself again. I spoke to neighbors I hadn't seen in years, quiet conversations over fences, nods of greeting at the postbox, small connections, but real. And I realized that I was not as invisible as I had believed, that there were still people who saw me, even if my own family did not. At night, I would lie in bed and listen to the house settle around me, the creak of the floorboards, the soft sigh of the wind at the eaves. And I would think of the years I had spent in these rooms, the life I had built, the love I had given. I would think of all that I had endured, and all that I still could. And I would feel, beneath the ache, a small, steady flame. It was not anger, it was not bitter, it was resolved. I went silent, yes, but in that silence, I found my voice. And soon, I knew, they would hear it not in words, but in the choices. I would make choices that were mine, and mine alone. The world outside remained cold, but inside, I felt the first stirrings of spring, a sense that change was coming, and that this time, it would be by my hand, and I was ready. The first true thaw of spring came quietly, almost shyly. I noticed it one morning as I opened the window, just a crack, and the breeze that drifted in smelled not of winter's sharpness, but of damp earth and something soft and green beneath the surface. The world outside was waking up, and so was I. I moved differently after that, not with haste or grand gestures. Those were never my way, but with quiet intent, the kind that builds slowly, like a stream carving its path through stone, certain of its direction even if the world isn't watching. I started with small things. Each morning, I would rise and write down a task, just one, that belonged to me and no one else. A drawer to sort, a letter to send, a recipe to try again after years of disuse. The act of choosing, of deciding for myself what the day would hold, felt like reclaiming lost ground. It was a quiet defiance, a way of reminding myself that I still had a say in the course of my own life. The money I had set aside grew little by little. I found ways to add to a piece of jewelry I no longer wore, sold to a kind-faced man who ran the shop on Main Street. Books I no longer read, donated to the library, but with a few chosen volumes, sold to collectors who knew their worth. Watched each deposit go in, small but steady, and with it, my confidence grew. The lawyer I had consulted was discreet and thoughtful. He guided me gently, helping me undo what had been done without my consent. My house was secured, again in name and law. The accounts that had been touched were restored. There were letters sent, formal and firm, that made it clear no further steps would be taken without my knowledge, without my permission. It was not vengeance that moved me. It was simply the need to right what had been quietly, wrongly, altered. I began to make plans beyond protection, beyond defense. I looked at my home, the home that for so long had felt like a wasteland. I saw, for the first time in years, the possibility of something new. I did not want to stay, not because I was being pushed out, but because I wanted to go. I wanted to choose the next chapter, instead of having it written for me. So I began to explore. I took longer walks, wandering streets I hadn't seen in decades. I took the bus into town, sat in the park with a sandwich, and watched the world move around me. I listened to the chatter of young mothers at the playground, the bark of dogs chasing balls, the laughter of teenagers too loud and full of life. I let it all soak in, and I felt part of it, not an observer, not an afterthought, but part of the living world. I visited a small coastal village once, on a whim. I took the train one morning with a thermos of tea and a heart that felt light. For the first time in a long while, I walked along the shore, the sea air filling my lungs, and watched the gulls wheel overhead. The cottages there were small, whitewashed, with gardens that spilled over with wildflowers, and I thought, here, I could build a quiet life here. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. The silence that I had embraced became a kind of armor, but also a kind of freedom. Without the noise of opinions, of suggestions disguised as concern, I could hear myself think, and what I heard was clear. I began to downsize on my own terms, not the rushed, forced clearing that had been suggested to me, but a thoughtful letting go. I sorted through my things, choosing what mattered, what held my history, what would come with me. The rest I gave away or sold or set aside for charity. Each item I released felt like shedding skin that no longer fit. I was not erasing my past. I was carrying forward only what belonged to the future I wanted to create. There were moments of fear, of course. Change always carries its shadows. In the quiet of night, I would sometimes lie awake, wondering if I was foolish, if I was chasing something that could not be found at my age. But then morning would come, the light would spill across my room, and I would feel that quiet flame inside me, steady and sure. I chose a small cottage near the sea, not in that first village I visited, but one not far. A place where I could walk to the shore, where the air smelled of salt and the wind carried the cries of seabirds. The cottage was humble 2 rooms, a garden overgrown but promising, but it was mine, purchased with my own savings, my own will, my own hand guiding the pen as I signed the papers. No one else's decision, no one else's plan. Moving day came quietly. I packed what little I kept into boxes, into the car I had rented. I locked the door of my old house behind me, not with sorrow, but with peace. It had been a good home, and it had served its time. Now it was time for something new. The first night in my new place, I stood on the small porch and watched the stars come out, one by one, in a sky so wide it made my heart ache. The sound of the waves reached me, steady and eternal. I breathed it in, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that I belonged to myself again. I moved differently after that. I walked the lanes of the village, learning the names of neighbors, the paths to the market, the way the light shifted over the sea as the day passed. I tended the garden, coaxing it back to life with patient hands. I joined a reading circle at the small library, shared tea with kind women who welcomed me without question, and I did it all quietly, without announcement, without fanfare. My family did not know, not yet. There would be time for that, or perhaps not. I was in no rush. I had found something more valuable than their understanding. I had found my own. The sea became my companion. Each morning, I walked its edge, letting the waves lap at my boots, watching the gulls soar and dive. And as I walked, I thought of the long road that had brought me here, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with gratitude for the strength I had found, for the courage to choose my own way. I moved differently after that, and every step felt like coming home. The first weeks in my cottage passed like a gentle dream, though I was fully awake for all of it. Every morning, I opened the curtains and let the sea's light pour in, casting soft ripples across the walls. I brewed my tea and carried it outside, standing barefoot on the porch, feeling the cool wood beneath my feet. The rhythm of the tide became the pulse of my new life. I had slipped away quietly, without announcement, without fanfare, and in that absence, something began to shift, not in me, but in them. At first, I imagined they did not notice. Perhaps they believed I was simply complying, falling in line with their plans at last. I did not answer their calls. I did not return their messages. My house stood empty, locked and waiting, a silent testament to the choice I had made. The neighbors saw the for sale sign removed, the car no longer in the drive, and they must have wondered where I'd gone. But no one came looking. No one knocked. It seemed my family assumed I was where they had left me, compliant, waiting to be moved as they saw fit. But the world has a way of revealing the holes left behind when someone steps away. I heard it first through a letter, one of those stiff, formal ones that spoke of matters unsettled. The lawyer, kind and steady as always, forwarded it to my new address. It was from a bank where Thomas had tried to access an account that no longer welcomed his signature. He had been turned away, confused, perhaps indignant. My silence had closed a door he had expected to remain open. There was more. I heard of it in pieces, small ripples that reached me through the most unexpected sources. A neighbor from the old street wrote me a kind note, saying how strange it was not to see me at the window, not to hear my greetings on her morning walks. She mentioned, almost in passing, that Hannah had stopped by the house, trying to gain entry, surprised, perhaps, to find the locks changed and no forwarding information left behind. I imagined that day Hannah standing on the porch where she had once brought me flowers for Mother's Day, now facing a door that would not open for her. I imagined her confusion, her worry, perhaps even her anger, but I felt no triumph in it, only a quiet sadness that it had come to this. that the space I had filled in their lives had been so easy for them to assume as theirs to manage. And now, with that space empty, they were left to reckon with the absence. There were financial matters, I knew. Things they had depended on without truly admitting it, even to themselves. Small supports I had provided, steady and unspoken. The birthday checks for the grandchildren that I always sent on time, the little gifts slipped into college funds or towards music lessons. Those small threads, woven so subtly into the fabric of their lives, had been pulled loose, and in their absence, the pattern began to fray. I heard, too, through another letter, that the arrangements they had made for me, the nursing home room, the deposit placed so confidently, had been forfeited. No one had come to claim it. No one had come to fill that space they had chosen for me. I had disappeared from their plans, and in doing so, I had left a hollow they did not know how to fill. It was not revenge that guided me. I did not watch from afar with a hardened heart. I thought of them often, in the quiet of the evenings, as the sea darkened beneath the setting sun. I thought of their faces, the way they had once looked at me with such need, such love, and I grieved for what had been lost not just by me, but by all of us, for the trust that had been eroded, for the closeness that had been replaced by duty and distance. And yet, I did not reach out. Not yet. It was not time. There was something they needed to learn, something only absence could teach, that I had not been a burden, that my presence, my care, my love, had been a gift they had taken for granted, that in losing the ease of my presence, they had lost more than they realized. In the village, I found small joys that soothed the ache of what was gone. The woman who ran the bakery learned my name and set aside a fresh roll for me each morning. The man at the post office shared stories of his grandchildren, his eyes crinkling with pride. The librarian recommended books she thought I'd enjoy, her voice warm and welcoming. I was seen here not as a task to manage, but as a person, whole and present. Sometimes, I would walk the shoreline and let the sea wind carry away the heaviness that still clung to me. I would watch the ships on the horizon and think of all the journeys people take, the ones they choose and the ones chosen for them, and I would be grateful that at last my journey was mine alone. They reached out, of course. More calls, more messages. The tone changed over time from confident reminders to puzzled inquiries, and then to worry, to please. I listened to their voices on the machine, heard the cracks forming in the certainty they had once carried. I read their emails, their letters, and I saw, at last, a hint of understanding, a dawning realization of what they had done and what they had lost. But still, I waited. It was not punishment. It was simply the space needed for truth to settle in, for them to see what my silence had shown them, that I was not theirs to manage, not theirs to place or remove like a piece on a board, that my absence left gaps they could not easily fill, because I had been, all along, a foundation they had forgotten to see. And so, the days passed, quiet and full. I tended the garden behind my cottage, coaxing life from soil that had been left untended for too long. I planted herbs by the kitchen door, and flowers along the path. I baked bread in the small oven, filling the house with the scent of home, and I wrote, sometimes, in a journal I kept by my bed. Not bitter words, not angry ones, just thoughts, memories, hopes. The sea kept me company. It reminded me that all things change, that tides rise and fall, that what is lost can sometimes be found again, but only if sought with open hands and honest hearts. I did not know if that was what they would do. I did not know if they would come to me, not out of duty or guilt, but out of love reborn. But I hoped, quietly, patiently. And in the meantime, I lived. I lived a life that was mine, shaped by my own choices, filled with small beauties and hard-won peace. And I watched, from this distance I had claimed, as they learned, day by day, what it meant to lose the quiet, steady presence they had mistaken for something that would always be there. What they lost without me was not just convenience, not just the easing of their own loads. They lost the anchor they had not known they were leaning on. And perhaps, in time, they would see. Perhaps, in time, they would understand. But whether they did or not, I was where I needed to be. And that, at last, was enough. The seasons turned, quietly in the village, as they do when one lives close to the sea. Spring softened into summer, the air warm and filled with the scent of salt and wildflowers. My days settled into a gentle rhythm. I rose early, tended the garden, walked the shore, read in the afternoons by the window, where the light pooled like gold on the floor. The cottage became home in the truest sense, a place where I belonged. Not because of who else claimed me, but because I had chosen it for myself. Yet, even in that peace, a part of me remained unsettled. Not with regret, not with doubt, but with the quiet weight of unfinished words. Words I had carried for too long. Words I had swallowed again and again, until they had grown heavy in my chest. It was in the long hours of the evening, when the sea murmured in the distance and the sky turned soft with stars, that I felt at most the need to set them down, to give shape to what I could no longer say aloud. And so, one night, I took out paper and pen, simple, plain things. I sat at the little table by the window, the lamp casting a small circle of light, and I began to write, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with the honesty that silence had ripened in me. The letter was not to my children. Not this time. It was to myself. To the woman I had been. The woman who had given so much, so quietly, for so long. The woman who had lost herself in the caring, in the giving, in the endless tide of others' needs. I wrote to her as if she were sitting across from me, her hands folded, her eyes tired but kind. I told her that I saw her, that I honored all she had done, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices unnoticed, the strength that went unpraised. I told her that she had been enough, more than enough, even when no one said the words, that she had carried love in every small act, every meal cooked, every wound tended, every tear wiped away. I wrote of the hurt, too, the slow erasure, the moments when her voice had been drowned out, when her worth had been measured only in what she could provide, the way she had been thanked with duty rather than true gratitude, the way she had been quietly set aside when her giving was no longer needed or no longer convenient. And then I told her what I had learned, that love given freely is never wasted, but that it must include oneself, that silence can be strength, but also a prison, if it keeps truth locked away, that it is never too late to reclaim one's voice, one's choices, one's life, that it is a kindness, not a cruelty, to draw the line where love must start with the self. The words flowed easily, as if they had been waiting all along. I wrote deep into the night, the house hushed around me, the sound of my pen on paper like a soft promise. When I was done, I folded the pages carefully, smoothed them with my hand, and set them on the table. For a while, I simply sat, watching the dark sky beyond the window, the stars bright and steady. I thought of the woman I had been, the woman I was now, and the long road between them. I thought of how much had been lost, and how much had been found. In the morning, I rose early, as I always did. I made tea, carried it out to the porch, and watched the dawn paint the sea in shades of pink and gold. The letter sat where I had left it, waiting. And as I sipped my tea, I knew what I must do. I took the letter outside, to the edge of the garden where the wildflowers grew. I knelt there, the earth cool beneath my knees, and I dug a small hollow in the soil. I placed the letter there, folded and worn from my hands, and I covered it gently. The earth took it, quiet and sure, and I felt something lift in me, a release, a letting go. It wasn't an act of hiding, or of burying what mattered. It was an offering, a way of saying, these truths are part of the soil now, part of the life I am planting here. They do not need to be carried any longer. They have been honored, they have been set free. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, not empty, not hollow, just unburdened. The garden seemed to bloom more brightly, the sea's song seemed sweeter. I walked with easier steps. I met neighbors with a smile that felt truer, less shadowed by the weight I had once carried. There were times, of course, when the past rose up in memory, when I thought of my children, of the life I had left behind, but the ache was softer now, no longer a sharp sting, but a gentle sorrow, a tenderness for what had been, and for what could not be. I continued to write, sometimes, not letters to be sent, not words to be shared, but reflections, hopes, small truths set down on paper for my own heart to hold. The act of writing became a kind of prayer, a way of staying rooted in the life I had chosen. And in all of it, I felt change. Not in grand, sweeping gestures, not in sudden revelations, but in the quiet way that tides reshape a shore, that time softens what was once jagged. I felt it in the mornings, as I opened my windows to the sea breeze. I felt it in the evenings, as I watched the stars emerge. I felt it most of all in the steady, certain knowing that I had chosen this life, and that in doing so, I had chosen myself. The letter had changed me. not because it spoke what others needed to hear, but because it spoke what I needed to tell. Because it gave form to the truths I had long carried, and in doing so, allowed me to set them down. And now, when I walk the garden path, when I tend the flowers that bloom above that small resting place of paper and ink, I feel a peace that words cannot quite name, a peace that comes from having honored what was, and from living fully in what is. There is still more ahead. I feel it in the air, in the pull of the tides, in the turning of the stars. But whatever comes, I know I will meet it with open hands and a quiet heart. And that, at last, is enough. My life is quiet now. It is the kind of quiet that settles deep, not empty, but full in its own way. The sea still sings to me each morning, the rhythm of the tides a gentle companion to my days. The garden flourishes beneath my care, a small patch of earth that answers back with color and life for every hour I spend tending to it. The cottage has become part of me, and I of it, a place shaped by my hands, warmed by my presence, filled with the soft, simple things that make a home. There are no great events that mark my time here, no grand celebrations or noisy gatherings. My joys come in small forms. The first rosebud opening on a spring morning, the scent of bread baking in my little oven, the way the light spills across the floor at dusk. I have found, at last, that these are the moments that matter, the ones that root me to the present, that remind me I am alive and whole. I walk each day along the shore, sometimes at dawn when the world is hushed and new, sometimes in the late afternoon when the sea glitters beneath the sun, the gulls call overhead, the waves lap at my boots, and I breathe in the salt air like it is a kind of prayer. I have learned to listen not to the voices of others, but to the quiet voice within myself, the one I silenced for so long. It speaks gently now, sure and steady, guiding me through these simple, blessed days. There are still letters, still calls that come from the life I left behind. I see their names on the envelope, and hear their voices on the machine, but I no longer feel the sharp pull of duty, or the ache of old wounds reopened. I answer when I choose, in my own time, in my own way. There is no anger left in me, only understanding. They did what they thought was best, in the only way they knew, and I did what I had to do to find myself again, to live a life that was mine. Sometimes, I think of them with a soft sorrow, like the echo of a song I once knew by heart. I remember the small hands of my children in mine, the way they looked at me with trust and need. I remember the sound of their laughter, the weight of them sleeping against my shoulder. Those memories are mine, and they bring no bitterness, only the quiet recognition of all that was given, all that was shared, and all that has now passed into what was in this life I have built. There is no space for regret, only room for the gentle unfolding of each day. I have come to see that peace is not something found in the approval or presence of others, but in the deep, steady knowing of one's own heart. I tend my garden, I bake my bread, I walk by the sea, and in these small acts I find more richness than I ever did in the noise of obligation and expectation. The village has welcomed me as one of its own, not for what I can offer or provide, but simply for who I am. I am the woman with the kind smile at the market, the steady hand at the library's reading circle, the quiet figure walking the shore at dawn. I am no longer defined by what I give to others, but by how I choose to live. And that choice has been the greatest gift of all. Evenings are my favorite now. When the light fades and the world grows soft and still, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the stars emerge, one by one. The sea darkens, the garden rests, and the air carries the sweet scent of earth and flowers. It is in these moments that I feel most at home in myself, most at peace with the long journey that brought me here. I write still, though not as often, small notes in my journal, thoughts caught like seashells along the shore of my mind. I write to remember, to give thanks, to hold close the lessons I have learned. That love given freely is never wasted, that silence can be a form of strength, but also a space where truth can grow, that it is never too late to choose a different path, to find a quieter, truer way of being. My family, I think, has begun to understand. Their messages come softer now, less full of instruction, more filled with simple words of care. I believe they have felt my absence in ways they did not expect. I believe they have learned, as I have, that presence is not to be taken for granted, that the ones who stand beside you, steady and quiet, are the ones who make the world feel whole. But I do not wait for them. I do not live for what may or may not come. My life is here, in this small cottage, in this garden, along this shore. My life is in the bread I bake, the flowers I tend, the air I breathe each morning. It is enough. And if they come to me one day, not out of duty or guilt, but out of love, reborn and real, I will welcome them. My door will open, my table will be set, my heart will be ready. But if they do not, that too will be as it should be. I have found my peace, and it is not dependent on what others choose. The sea reminds me, always, that all things change, that tides rise and fall, that what is lost can sometimes return, but that the shore remains, steady beneath our feet. I am that shore now, shaped by time and tide, but strong, enduring, and quietly beautiful. I wasn't angry, I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.